Hello, welcome to our special Cubase 12 walkthrough of new features live stream. So this will be a different format than what we have typically. So usually on Tuesdays and Fridays, starting at this time for about 4 hours, we usually have kind of a free form Q&A session where people can ask questions and get answers, and we'll try to go through. We usually get about 100 questions per session. We try to answer them. But since Cubase 12 was just released, we figured we would take this moment to walk through some of the different it's through the new features and kind of detailed so we could get a sense. So I will be checking the chat periodically, but we'll try to go through each little section kind of in different themes so that we could get through a lot of different functions. So just on Wednesday, March 2nd, Cubase 12 was released, and it's going to be kind of for all different levels of Cubase 12. Some of the major new features that we'll see, and I don't have some of the hardware capabilities to kind of show all this so we could mention it. So one of the biggest things, and we know that there's kind of a, as always, a transition when we're doing updates and licensing. So with the licensing system, we know that some people have had problems getting the e-licenser kind of migrated to the new licensing system. And if you're not familiar with it, basically, there's a new licensing system called the Steinberg Activation Manager. And what's going to happen if you're an existing user is we'll take your existing license and it's going to be converted into a non-upgradable license. It'll still work with your Cubase 11, but going from that point on, that license on the USB e-licenser will be utilized for all previous versions, and going forward will be on a new licensing system. So if you want to still run Cubase 11 and earlier, you would need to have the USB e-licenser, and going forward, Cubase 12 and subsequent releases, we will just simply be on the new licensing system. So what happens is basically your license will turn into a non-upgradable license. It still works with the Cubase 11 and current versions, and at that point you would go to the Steinberg activation system or the Steinberg activation manager, and that will allow you to run up to run your single license on up to 3 different computers. So it's a single activation, so you don't have to check in every month or every 3 months, and it will just kind of go through and allow you to run that your one single license on multiple systems. Now, there's a lot of confusion I've seen on different social media groups. It's like, I upgraded, I'm running this, but some of my instruments still need the USB E license, or I disconnected it, and now my Hallian or Groove Agent doesn't work, like the full version of Groove Agent. We will see the other programs in time migrate to the new licensing system, but currently the only 3 programs that are utilizing it are going to be Cubase, and then we have Dorico. Cubase and Dorico are the only ones. And if you wanted to experiment with the new licensing system, you get Dorico SE, which is a free version of Dorico. But if you have Wavelab, Nuendo, Hallian, other virtual instruments, some of those will be migrating, but we won't necessarily see all of those working right out of the box. For Mac users, one of the most common questions I get on live streams is, what about M1 support? So Cubase 12 is M1 native, so it has support for that. And there's also one of the questions and confusions that I see a lot about is VST2 and VST3, because Steinberg announced about 4 to 6 weeks ago, that within 2 years that the host programs would probably not be able to run VST2 plugins. So VST3 came out in, I believe, 2008. So it's been 14 years. So there's been some companies that haven't migrated. Most of the companies that are still in VST2 format only are actively working for VST3. So VST2 plugins don't run natively on the Apple M1 processors. So if you want to utilize that, you'd have to run in Rosetta mode. So, but VST, if you're running Cubase on Windows program, you're not going to have any change. So it's just an Apple M1 that the VST plugins, VST2 plugin specification won't be running natively on that. And that's because the VST3 has been out for, again, 14 years to do this. On the Windows side, we'll also see more, we'll have support for the AMD Threadripper processors. So if you have one of those with, the high number of cores, it's been optimized for that, as well as WinRT, and that's like wireless Bluetooth MIDI. So, those are some of the new functions. I don't have those to actually show, but I just wanted to mention that. So let's take a look at some different themes of feature sets. So as we kind of work with this, well, one of the things that we want to do is we always want to kind of speed up editing for people. So there's kind of a whole slew of new editing things. And sometimes these are small, subtle things, but if you do it, 100 times a day, 1,000 times a week, these things can really add up and significantly affect your workflow. So we'll take a look at some editing. Then we'll get into some importing, exporting, warping, controllers, and some other features. But we'll start with some editing things. And again, this is going to be just one of the themes of kind of a multi-themed, presentation, is showing you the new stuff. So one of the things that people had complained about was that the scroll bars were small. So the scroll bars have been brightened and enlarged so that they are much easier to see and to access, like in our mix console. So when we wanted to come here, we could easily kind of scroll and see those. So the scroll bars are going to be bigger and more obvious to work with and to access. When doing editing, we also have the capability of some new nudging commands. So if I want it to come, we'll look at our nudge factor here. So I'm going to add my nudge toolbar, and we can see that as we want it to nudge a particular event, that when we nudge, it's going to be based upon the actual primary time display. So if I'm in bars and beats and I choose to nudge, I could nudge based on, I could choose to nudge by, my different quantized values. So if I say, okay, I want to nudge by a quarter note, I could just come right over here. So we could just say, I want it to be a bar. So let's say I just want it to now nudge by bar. We could do that. Or if I wanted to nudge by beat, we can now nudge just by a simple beat as well. So if I just choose beat now, so as soon as I come here, we can now just nudge accordingly. But sometimes people would want to nudge in a different time format than what the primary time display was. So if we go to our nudge panel here, we could choose to nudge in seconds. So if I wanted to nudge by seconds, I could now come here and say, okay, now I want to nudge by 1, 10, 100, or 1,000 milliseconds, or 1 second. So as I nudge, I can nudge in a different time format than when I do nudging that's going to be just tied to the bar and beat. So some people, if they wanted to nudge an event 10 milliseconds, they would have to switch the primary time display to, if they were in bars and beats, 2 seconds, and then just be able to nudge. But now we could decouple the nudging from the actual primary time display format. So as we work with that could be very handy to work with. So we've always had like really great range selection functionality, and this has been expanded. So if I select a particular range, I can come over here, and in previous versions, we could nudge like the start of the range. And again, this would be by the nudge factor. I could nudge the start to the left with key commands, or to the right, or we could nudge the end to the left or the end to the right. And we can see these in key commands area. But now we could do some additional key commands have been added. So if I wanted to nudge the top up or the top down, or the bottom down, or the bottom up. We could have extended control for the particular nudge commands. And this is really handy because now you could actually do it from keyboard shortcuts or drive it from a particular control surface. And even if I wanted to now just like nudge the start of events, if I have it where there's more data to the left, I could nudge the start to the left or nudge the start to the right as well, kind of using these particular commands. Now, there's been some additional, one of the great things that people have always loved, and I've seen many producers use this when kind of creating beats, is the ability to kind of slip events within the actual event. So if you have data that's before or after the particular event boundaries, we could choose to hold down the Alt or Control key or Command plus Option and slip. We can now assign this to key commands. So if I wanted to slip to the left, and we'll go ahead and look at the key commands area, and we'll see this under editing. So under edit, so now we could just nudge, we could nudge or slip the events with the content within the events just from different keyboard shortcuts as we do this. In previous versions of Cubase, I could take an event here, and let's say I have this selected event. We could go to our edit, and we could move just the start of the event to the cursor. And I just got asked this on the live stream a couple weeks ago. What about moving the end of the event to the cursor? So now we could just move the event ends to the cursor just that easily. So we can move the event starts and the event ends to the particular cursor. And this also works when we wanted to do MIDI editing. So I'm going to select all of my MIDI notes, and I'll just say move, move to start of the cursor. So now all my MIDI notes the start will be moved directly to the beginning of the cursor. And if I go to the end, I could say move the end of all of the selected events, move the end to the cursor, and all of those events will now be moved directly there. One thing that a lot of our film composers found a little annoying, and we listened to workflows from many different people, is when they go to enter the cursor position, I think it's Shift P, that you could enter the time in here. So let's say I wanted to go to measure 22 or a specific SMPTE time code frame. So if I say, okay, let's go to measure 22, that when they would hit enter, the song position would move, but this window would remain open, and they would have to hit enter twice. And again, if you do this, 20 times an hour, having to double close a window twice was annoying. So now when I hit measure 22, I'm just going to come right over here and I hit enter. It's going to move the play position and get rid of the particular enter cursor position dialog. As we want to come over here, let's take a look at just moving some of the playhead positions. So now if I wanted to nudge the playhead, we had different keyboard shortcuts that would nudge by one bar forward or backward, or nudge by one frame forward or backward. And this could be really handy for go to this event, like in macros, go to a particular event, then nudge one frame to the right, select the event under the cursor, and then do a particular function on that event. But now we've extended this where we could also choose to nudge the playhead position by 5, 10, or 20 seconds. So now I could just say, let's go 10 seconds forward, 20 seconds back, and these are all just 20 seconds forward, 20 seconds back. These are all just different key commands that are now available. So if you're driving from a control surface or a controller or keyboard shortcuts, that you could navigate quite easily. There's been some new consolidation of fades. So when we want to go to our audio menu, there used to be kind of fades kind of littered throughout the audio menu. These have now been consolidated. So if we wanted to go to our fades window, we can come over here. And we can now at this point just say, okay, I want to do crossfades. And in previous version, we could remove fades together, but we couldn't remove just a fade in or a fade out independently. So if I wanted to just remove the particular fade out right from this position, we'll just say, okay, we'll remove the fade out, but we don't remove the fade in. One of the things that is kind of always annoyed me personally was if I had a series of events in my fade here, and let's say I wanted to fade out starting here. So I just kind of do a clip based fade. And then let's say, okay, I want it to fade only to last to right here at this moment in time. Let's say where my playhead is. But, and as I would come here and resize the events, that the fade position would be affected and would move earlier with the resizing. So now if we hold down Alt or Control or Command plus Option, we can adjust the size of the event while maintaining the fade position just that easily. It's a really handy feature. Also, we see kind of new crossfade functionality. So if I wanted to come and we'll take a look at these events here, and I'll do a crossfade just by hitting the letter X. All right, so now we want to go to our crossfade editor. So I'm going to double click and we see an extended crossfade editor. I saw someone said online that they thought we'd stolen this from a different program, and we actually just kind of stole it from Nuendo. But we see kind of more extensive crossfade editing. So if I wanted to play just, fade out, fade in, crossfade, we could come here. We could have kind of independent fade ins from fade outs if we wanted. So we'll see lots of different options. So say, okay, let's just come here. I wanted a completely different fade in from my fade out. I want this to be more sinusoid. But one of the things that gets to be annoying, especially if we have a lot of crossfades. Now watch, we can nudge within a crossfade editor, and we often see this like in classical music. So I'm going to zoom in and let's just look at this crossfade. So when I go to my crossfade editor and I nudge, what happens most of the time is there's what we call chaining mode. In previous versions of Cubase, it would be kind of, the chaining mode would be set to none. So as I move and nudge the audio within this crossfade, we'll see that this crossfade is automatically going to get messed up. So everything that we did in this crossfade, the audio is shifting. So if we don't want that to happen, if I wanted to keep every crossfade that I've meticulously done to be maintained afterwards, I'm going to just click here and I'm going to put the chaining mode until end. So now as I nudge the crossfade, these events all the events afterwards will automatically move together so that their crossfade isn't messed up or affected by nudging the different crossfade values here. So a wonderful tool for working with that. So fades have been, just, more power, more capability. Now, obviously, Steinberg does a lot of work with ARA tools. So if you wanted to almost launch into a different editor for doing ARA type of edits, like using spectral layers, wonderful, amazing tool. So now if we wanted to, it used to be that we would select an event, go to audio, to extensions, and then we could just load up spectral layers. Now we could actually just come on the track level. So I'll just choose no extension, instead of having to select each audio event, I'm going to, within the track itself, come over here and just say, we'll launch spectral layers. And now as we double click on an event, all of the events on this particular track will automatically be loaded into the spectral layers editing, the ARA editing environment. And if we wanted to do like a particular edit here. Let's say, okay, I just wanted to get rid of that. So we'll delete some of the audio. And if I wanted to make an edit permanent or to apply an edit, there's always confusion of how to apply. Do I have to bounce selection? One of the things we could do is actually just drag it to an empty track, and we could choose, do you want to bounce the extension events? So we could do it that way. I'll just choose no here. Let's undo. Or we could choose to, at the track level, just say make the track extension permanent. So all of my edits that I've made within the ARA editing environment, we could just embed them right there, or remove the extension on the track altogether itself. So lots of flexibility and a more streamlined approach to how people work with multiple events on a single audio file when working with extensions. Now, working with this also, we could say, let's take a look at our sample editor. So there's lots of little enhancements that have been done, user interface enhancements that have been done within the sample editor inspector. So these have been kind of updated. So when we come over here, we can see, like, if we go to hit points, we'll have like a little, some different functions here to hide or show particular different aspects. So if you don't need to see those all the time, you could see more functions, or if you need to see them, it's just one quick mouse click. But there's also been some new zooming capabilities. So let's say I want it to have a global zoom. So if I'm going between different events in the sample editor and I wanted to have these events automatically kind of, the size. So I double click on this event, I go here. So we have this set to our zoom to global zoom. So when I come here, we could see not the entire event, but we could see kind of the same zoom factor for applied to different tracks, whether it makes sense or not. So if these are different lengths, I may want to have these be clip-based zoom. So now when I double click on an audio file, we could see, let me just come over, I could see the entire clip laid out for me. So let's say if we come here, I can see the clip laid out for me, or I could, now when I double click on a smaller event, I could see the entire event based here on or when I go to auto zoom. So now when I'm in auto zoom, I can see the entire event, and I go to a much smaller event, I see the entire event. Now let's say on this event here, I have zoomed in a pretty good deal. This is when we could select clip-based zoom. So I could say when I'm in this clip, I want my zoom factor to be there. When I'm in this particular clip, I may want to see the zoom factor be different. So now when I go back to this track where I had zoomed in and we have it set to clip-based zoom, the zoom factor where we were is automatically maintained. So we don't have to sit there and kind of redo the zoom settings and zoom factor for every single track when we start to work with that. People had wanted more precise automation capabilities. So when we wanted to come here and we have automation now, we could choose to set the automation resolution. So if we come to our studio setup, we can now select our audio system, and we can see our volume automation precision. So now we could go down to a single sample. I believe it defaults to 8 samples, but here you could go down to a single sample. So it'll be sample accurate automation capabilities. Now, we have lots of composers that love Cubase and use it for composing to picture. And one of the dilemmas that they will always run into is they compose to a particular video and everything is timed perfectly, and then they get word of the inevitable video edit. So there's been changes to the video. So the number of video tracks, we now have 2 separate distinct video tracks. So I could have one video track that will be set for maybe the original cue, and a new video track that could be the edited cue, so that I can make references to the original video and to the edited video and see them both. So very handy feature with that. Some of our clients also wanted to, and I saw kind of like joy. Someone was so happy, a composer was so happy with this function that they wanted, was they always want to see more mixer. So in previous versions of Cubase, we could see 3 different mix consoles. We've now added a 4th mix console. Now, as we do this, some people even ask why we have 3 different mix consoles. And what we could do is see different types of tracks. So I may want to look at all of my audio here. And then mixer 2, I may want to see my inputs and outputs. I may want to see virtual instruments on mixer 3. I may want to see groups and effects on mixer 4. So we could have 4 separate distinct mixers that will all be included directly there. So those are some of the things that are in the editing. Now we'll take a look at some additional importing and exporting functions. So let's go ahead and take a look. We'll listen to this example here. So let's say we're going to have a track that plays back. And let's say, very typical, I'm going to have like my snare. My snare track here is going into a group. So let's say, as we just play back the project here quickly. So we have a drum group. So if I wanted to just like come in, let's say, okay, I just want to mute. I'll just mute some other sources here quickly. So as we work on this, we can say, okay, I'm going to just solo a particular source. So in our group, and I go to the snare, we have our snare is going into our drum group, and the snare is also going to an effect send. When we go to the effect send here on this particular channel, we would notice that the effect send, when we select it, is going to our stereo output. So what a lot of people want to do is, and let's say in our guitars, we have guitar groups, and our guitars are going to a group, and the group and these guitars have effects that are going to an effect send. So we have... So if I wanted to make a stem of my drums and my guitars that have effects on them, we would think that we would come over to our export audio mixdown. And as we go to the export audio mixdown, I could say, let's go to our drum group and to our guitar group. And many people come to the effects section and they would come and just say, okay, we're gonna export with the send effects. All right, and what would happen is when we export that, and I created this export in Cubase 11, and if we listen to our drums, so we listen to our drum group, there's our drum mixdown, there would be no reverb. All right, we listen to the guitars. So again, no effects, but in the export audio mixdown, many people would think that, okay, I do my export audio mixdown, I want to mix down the groups, and that would include all the effects because I told it to. But actually, the group effects here aren't going to the reverb. The individual tracks are going to the reverb, and the reverb isn't going into the group. And the reverb is going to a stereo output. So that's why the effects weren't included. So there was a definite logic to it. But in the end, people just wanted to be able to include the effects when they created a group mixdown on the individual tracks. Now, what some people would do is get to the point where they go, okay, what I'll do is I'll take the output of the effects channel, and then they would send this to the group. But if you had other tracks that were feeding the particular group, you might get the reverb from a different track bleeding into the mix down. So it would often kind of sound like this. So we have the effects on the snare, but that snare was also, the reverb on the snare was also feeding the guitar. So I hear the effects on a guitar in my drum mix down. So technically right, but not what people actually wanted to do. So at this point, we've changed the routing so it doesn't do it technically correct, but actually accomplishes what people want to. Because what we would see many people do, especially composers, is they would have for each group, maybe they had a winds group, a brass group, a percussion group, strings, that they would have a separate, the same reverb, but in each of the groups. So it'd be like kind of duplicated because they were worried about the timpani reverb feeding into the winds export. So now when we come over here, I'm going to just say, I want to take and do my group exports. We'll come over here and we'll do our export audio mixdown. And at this point, we'll say, okay, we're going to have our drum group and our guitar group, and we're going to create an audio file. And we'll put it into the project. So as we make this, this will be placed into our project. So we now have our drum group. So when you listen to our drum group, we'll hear the effect on the snare. We don't hear the guitar bleeding through, even though it's sharing the same reverb. And we go to the guitar. We don't hear the snare coming through. So for people working with like large templates, that's a big deal and kind of a subtle change, but it kind of works the way that people would want it to work as opposed to worrying about being technically correct. Now, as we also work with different importing and exporting options, when we go to import tracks from a project, one of the great things that we could do is also just come over and let's say if I wanted to select a particular project here, we now have the option of importing signature and tempo tracks using the import tracks function. So if you wanted to import signature or tempo tracks from other projects, before we could import a tempo track separately, but not within the import track options dialog box. So as we want to do some more exporting, another aspect of exporting that could be tricky was when we wanted to deal with sidechains, because sidechains can be tricky. So let's say if we have a function where we wanted to do a sidechain control, so we'll just take a listen to this. So every time the kick comes in, it's triggering a sidechain on a compressor for this bass sound. So what would happen is when we do an export audio mixdown, it wouldn't look for all the different sidechain inputs. It would almost be like a solo in place and it would export it. But again, it's technically correct, but it's not what people wanted. So if I wanted to even come over and do an export audio mixdown, or even if we do a render in place, we can come over here to our render settings. I'll just choose my complete signal path here. And as we do a render in place, we can now see that the file that's been created now will automatically apply the sidechain input. So we'll just double click on it so you can see the effect of the sidechain when doing exported audio mixdown or doing render in place. That will be taken into account. So two little subtle things that, can just make a world of difference as people are actually kind of working in their particular projects. Now, one of the things that we see people working with, especially if they're doing maybe something that's a bit more non-linear, is when we have, let's say, different events. Maybe we're doing something that's maybe like a sidechain. So I will come here, or let's say I'm doing maybe like a sound design thing where I have different sound effects. They're not really laid out on a musical grid, but maybe we have these all just on one single track. I'm making beats, whatever, doing a sampling session. So we have all of these different events. Now, before, what we could do, and it was pretty slick, we could create a cycle marker around the events and then export each of these events independently. But having to create a cycle marker around 100 events on one single track could be time consuming as well. So now I could select different events, and as we go to the events, what I want to do is we could say export selected events. And this will just be very similar to our render in place functions. I could say, let's export these as separate events. I want it to include the EQ and inserts. I want it to include effect sends or the master effects. We could add a tail if we needed to. We could use custom names. And we could choose a different location for the files to be saved to. So instead of having to take like 10 or 100 or 10,000 different audio events and export them individually, I could select the events and export the selected events with different processing, different tail modes, and different naming conventions on them. So we could just kind of get all of your files exported quickly and easily. One of the topics that comes up in multiple live streams that we do is about warping. So let's take a look at some of the new warping capabilities. So we'll come over here. Let's say we'll listen to our performance here. And I had a friend deliberately play bad guitar for us for our example. So it was probably pretty hard for him because he's a good musician. But let's go ahead and take a listen and say probably many of us have come into different scenarios where maybe the timing of the guitar isn't quite as good. A little early, a little late at times. Especially coming up here. All right, so if we wanted to do warping, one of the things that was always available is we could do it in the sample editor. And there's been some changes with this. So if we look at our sample editor and we go to our hit points, Cubase will automatically calculate the hit points for us as the file is recorded. Now, when we come to our audio warp, we could say, okay, and we click on free warp, we can see that the user interface has been kind of changed here so that, probably when you're in audio warp, free warp is the most common thing you want to do. So it's bigger. Now, as we look at this, we could see kind of our grid here. Now, we have two important buttons. So we see where we could actually look at our musical grid. So I'm going to say, we'll put our grid to beat. So as we look at beats and we click on this button just to the left here, we can now see the beats we can see the grid lines show up here. So we see these lines showing up on the beat. So as we do this, we can see the beat. And now if I wanted to come here, we could just put in our snap, and that's the letter J. So now if I wanted to put in warp markers, what we need is warp markers to actually move the events in time. So if I wanted to take this, once we have the free warp tool active, I will come here and we could kind of see this little triangle here. And this will automatically kind of give us a guidepost here of where the hit points were. So I could say, okay, let's come here. And I just want to put in some different warp markers as we go along. So now that I've entered in warp markers, I could move these to our different grid lines. So I'm going to choose to move this to the beat. And how we see which warp marker we are going to affect is as we hover near it, just to the left of the two arrows, we'll see it turn white when we get near it. So now at this point, I want to be able to just kind of nudge it to the beginning of that note directly to the beat. So this way we can see it will just kind of snap in. We'll see it just kind of snap right in. Now, one thing that people wanted was the ability to, when we did this, the editor was pretty much only working in tuplets. So if we wanted to work with triplets, that was very difficult. So now I could say, let's use the quantize. Let's set our quantize value here to quarter note triplet. And as we move, it'll now snap based on quarter note triplets. Now, as we do this, a lot of people mess up warping because they will take like one event and they want to move this event and they realize that they move kind of all of the different events. So you may want to just kind of put an event before or after, and then you could nudge without affecting the audio afterwards or previous to that. Now, there's some other little handy things that we could do as well. So let's say if we go to our free warping, I'm going to just come over here and reset the warp markers. And we start off with hit points. So since we have our hit point detection, one quick way of populating warp markers is I'll come here, let's edit the hit points, and we'll just say, okay, let's adjust our threshold and the intensity. And at this point, I'll just say, create warp markers. So now when I go into, and we could also do this from our audio menu to real-time processing, and we could choose to create the warp markers from hit points. So now when we go to our audio warp and enable free warp, all of the hit points have now populated and transitioned directly into warp markers for us. So now I could just move this without having to worry about setting previous or post warp marker events without having that. So warping to grids. Now, there's also scenarios, pretty typical, two microphones on a guitar, an acoustic guitar. So we have two different tracks. So if I wanted to select both of these tracks, I'm just going to hit Control or Command E. And as we do that, now we can see we'll have both of these tracks in our sample editor. So we could switch back and forth between the two different tracks. And we have this little clip editing mode. By default, it'll switch to all clips. So let's say if I want to now edit all clips, so I have two guitar tracks, I'll just manually add some of my warp markers here. And let's go ahead and kind of zoom. We'll make these a bit larger. So as we look at this, so now I'm going to just do warp editing. We'll see that those changes are applied to both tracks. So very easy to warp multiple parts from within the sample editor. But the thing that most people wanted to do was to be able to now kind of take in a different approach and just warp directly on the project window. So if I wanted to take my bass part here, again, I could select the event and we'll go to my audio. Let's create our warp markers. And now as we switch, our warp tool in our project window is now kind of switched to being in free warp. So at this point, as we zoom in, we could just come right over here and I could warp directly on the main project window. And so if I wanted to do this for multiple parts, again, I would just select the multiple events and I could just warp directly on the project window that easily. Now, sometimes we may have kind of a multi-mic drum kit. So let's say at this point, I have all of my drums set into a folder. So we have a folder here. And we could enable group editing, which has been there since, I think, version 6. But we now, as we want to go to our warp editing, we can now come over here and just see this little button here, and this will allow us to do kind of phase coherent warping. So as I would drop in different warp markers here, so we'll just kind of click right here, and we will just go to, we'll select the events. I can now, with phase coherency, warp all of my different drum tracks or multi-mic'd tracks together just that easily. So if you don't see it, just come over here and try, maybe zooming in a little bit, and then you could see your different warp markers visible directly there. So people have been wanting this for a long time, to be able to warp two parts, to be able to warp directly in the project window. So again, the warp editing now has a dedicated free warp tool as we work with that. All right, now one of my favorite features is when it's very simple to work with. The chord track, when it was first introduced, was kind of a revolutionary aspect of the program. So I want to come here and let's listen to a project, and we'll just come. First met, that was long. So we'll listen to this particular project. So let's say it's going to be mostly acoustic guitar based. Do you recall the day we first met? That was a long time ago. So mostly acoustic guitar. And we have vocals and maybe some bass. And background vocals. You look my way and your heart shone through. So we have the chord track, and what people would do is they could manually add chords into the chord track, and they could do this. But if they don't have a good sense of music theory, it was hard for them to figure out what chords. And this is a very typical question. What chords do I actually use? So, and if we had a MIDI part, we could select the MIDI part, go to your project menu, and go to the chord track and choose create chord events. And we could do that from the MIDI data. But obviously, like in this case, it's going to be based around and built around the acoustic guitar. So I have an empty chord track here. So what I want to do now is just drag and drop the audio file. And I could do this with a full mix, multiple audio files, or a single event. And now it's automatically created our chord track for us right here. So as we work with this, we can now see the chord track laid out for us. It tells us the key and the chords that are being used. Now, if we wanted to refine, because obviously when we deal with audio, there could be a lot of variables, especially different chord inversions. But when we do an audio detection of chords from an audio file, we'll see this little icon here in the upper right-hand corner. So what that's going to allow us to do, if we needed to refine the search a little bit or refine the selection, we could double-click. And when we go to the chord assistant, we have a new function here for detected, and it will give you different suggestions if you don't think that is the chord. But basically, this works way better than it should. So if I wanted to go back to a previous example, and let's say, okay, let's come to our warping example here. I could just take a particular rhythm guitar part here, and we could also just say, let's come and from our chord track, say create chord events, and even directly right from here. And again, it's not limited to just being guitars, but we can see that it's just going to create the chord track for you that easily. Now in Cubase 5, very audio was introduced. So if we wanted to do, editing graphically of your vocal tuning and pitch, we could do this. And what we introduced with the chord track in version 8 was the ability to actually colorize the events based upon the chord track, where we see red notes are out of key and green notes are in key. And in version 11, we introduced something in the MIDI key editor called the scale assistant, which would allow us to define a particular scale. So I could say, oh, I'm in the key of F, or I'm in the key of A. And then as we do editing, we could restrict particular edits to that key. So I could define my key here, or we could actually just use the chord track. So as we use the chord track, we have some wonderful new additions that people have been asking for a long time in the very audio editor. So at this point, we'll say we have what we call scale note guides. So we see kind of this background. We see where it's kind of white and dark. It's a little subtle, but now as I click on this, we'll see that that will change. And now we can see exactly which notes are directly in key. So if we wanted to come here, we could just do that. And if we wanted to only snap the particular event to key as well. So as I move events and I change the pitch, now I can't move it out of key. So if I always want that to be in key, I could just check that. And now with that checked off, I can move it to where it turns red, where it's out of key. But with this enabled, what I could do now is it will restrict the key to only be in your defined key from the chord track that was, again, automatically detected from the particular guitar part, or manually set. Now, to make it even easier for people, I could select all of my segments, just hit Control A. And at this point, I'm going to say, oh, let's just quantize the pitch. And now we could quantize the pitch to the particular key as well. So again, if you have a really great sense of music theory and harmony, you may not need those tools. But if you don't have a good sense of what's going on, and you want an easy, fast fix that's going to work musically, the new scale detection in the very audio is a perfect solution for that. All right, so we have a new instrument that's been included, and we actually have it kind of in this particular example. So let's take a look at it. So this new instrument is called Verve, and it's a felt tip piano. So it's an 11, I think it's 11 or 12 velocity layer felt tip piano. So it's intended to be kind of a very subtle piano, so not like a real sharp attack. So it's a felt, soft, very textured piano. And the Verve will work inside of Halion Sonic SE. So you will need to get the latest version of Halion Sonic SE for this to show up. But it will now, when you come over here, it'll just show up as Verve. And I believe that this instrument is sold separately, or will be sold separately. So when we look at it, it's going to be very simple controls as soon as we select it here. So we have kind of our global page. So if I wanted to just kind of play, we could listen to it. So we have, now as we want to listen to this, we have, we could set 4 kind of macro controls. So we have distance, like the close to far mics. We have a balance, because what we have is kind of 3 different components. We have a piano, a texture that's layered, as well as effects. So if I only wanted to hear the piano, I could just adjust the balance. And now if I wanted to hear just kind of the layered texture, and let's say I only wanted to hear that. And we could also have different variations as well. And let's say if I wanted to have maybe more like a filter, I'll just turn. So if I want it to be brighter. So that's what we kind of have on our main page. But if we wanted to just come over here and say, okay, I only wanted to hear the piano without the effects or the texture. I could just click on texture and effects and turn those off. So if we want to look at our piano settings, we could see, okay, again, our distance, our resonance level, compression, our reverb send, release level, typical functions. When we go to our texture, we could now come over and just say, okay, what texture do I want layered with it? And there's a number of different options for layering the particular texture. So let's say I want like strings. And now I want it to come over here and let's go to the effects. So I could have a delay that's on the particular piano layer or the texture layer. So we could have different delay options as well as different reverbs that will be included. But the beauty of this is how well this just kind of fits into so many different tracks. Like let's say an acoustic guitar, like often you would have problems of the acoustic guitar that may be bright layering with the piano and those two clashing with each other. Or if you're doing kind of like TV soundtrack work, these types of textures are perfect for that. But let's go ahead and just kind of take a listen to the track and we'll see that the Verve piano comes in right here.
Waiting on our yellow coach to ferry us home. You looked my way and your heart shone through. It caught my breath while you caught.
So we'll just go ahead and solo it. And if we take this out in the middle of the project,
seems like a long, long time ago. And our first kiss, there was
and having it layered with the guitar. Just that perfect kind of produced element in a project that just kind of fills that glue. Bypass it. As soon as you take it out, it's kind of missing something. It's kind of unquantifiable. You put it in and it suddenly sounds produced.
And I know your dad's pretty happy now, 'cause what began as our first kiss, it started all of this.
So a really beautiful texture to have in your palette of different sounds to just kind of work. Where a typical piano, you may have to do a lot of tweaking to kind of get that to fit into so many different contexts and different production needs. This, you just kind of turn it on and it fits in beautifully. Some of the plugins, the audio plugins have also been updated. I'll do something highly inappropriate with this. And let's say the step filter has been updated. So I'm going to put this on a guitar, on acoustic guitar, which seems almost sacrilegious, but we'll show it to you here. So there's two new functions that have been added in the step filter. So this allows us to kind of have a filter that we could control in different steps. But we added the ability to randomize the cutoff as well as the resonance. So even if you wanted to take kind of an acoustic guitar, we'll just kind of blend this in and solo this. I just wanted to add like an interesting color, like maybe how someone would add color in acoustic on an electric guitar. So I'll just add this. So you just kind of take the step filter and randomize the resonance. If you want to listen to that in context.
Seems like a long, long time ago. And our first kiss, there was no regret. Right after that Garth Brooks show.
And we'll bypass that, so you just,
You told your daddy and
we could blend more of that in.
said you were too damn good for any boy that.
And if we want to say, okay, and you can see kind of in the background, the display kind of changed there. Now, one of the plugins that we've been hearing this whole time as the song plays is a new limiter plugin called Razor. So we'll come over here and just take a listen to it. And this will actually, it's a very fast limiter plugin. So when we wanted to use this, this will be probably on your master bus. It will find its way home there. It's going to do automatic intersample clipping detection. You'll have the ability to link the limiting on the left and right channel if you wanted to, but a lot of different release options. So let's go ahead and just kind of listen to how clear and transparent it is and how fast you can get it to be.
Parking lot, waiting on our yellow coach to ferry us home. You looked my way and your heart shone.
And now we'll turn it on.
It caught my breath while you called me to. Well, even now I'm so in love with you, just like a long time ago.
It's a really high quality limiter plugin, Razor.
Oh, I remember the day that we went. Seems like a long, long time ago. And our first kiss, there was no regret. Right after that Garth Brooks show, you told your daddy and he called my mom. Said you were too damn good for any boy that dumb. His sour words are now dead and done. That was a long, long time ago.
All right. Now, one other plugin that has been changed to be aware of is the Apogee UV22 is no longer in Cubase 12. And that is going to be the dithering plugin, and that's now been replaced with the Lin 1 dither. If you had any projects that were using the Apogee UV22, those settings have automatically been migrated directly to this new version. Any track presets, any effects chain presets, those will now automatically set the same exact parameters in the Lin 1 dither, so that you don't really have to worry about that being such an issue. Now, one of the plugins that was a bit more creative, one of the new plugins, is one called FX Modulator. So a lot of people, I think, saw the description of this and don't really have such a great sense of what it does, but they think it's going to be interesting. And I've really enjoyed kind of learning this particular plugin. So let's go ahead and take a look at it. So let's say I wanted to just work on one. I just wanted to make something a little more interesting musically. And this is great. Like a lot of times you may just have one voice, but you want to add something kind of rhythmic, but maybe not add drums. It's a perfect solution for that. So let's listen to this project. And now as we come over here, let's say I want to solo my pad sound. So we have an audio file here and we wanted this to be more rhythmically interesting. So I'll come over to my retro log now, or to the FX modulator. Now how it works is we have 14 different effects that can be loaded into 6 independent modules. So if I wanted to start, I'm going to say, okay, let's load up a volume effect into a particular module. If we wanted to double click, we could add points and we could set the amount of time that this occurs. And we could switch this from seconds to musical divisions from 16 measures to a dotted 30-second note. So let's say I want this to occur over a single measure. So what this means is that this volume will come here, increase It will decrease, increase, and decrease over the course of one measure. Now, if we wanted to just come over here, we could have the program kind of automatically generate random curves for us as well. So if I wanted to do something like that, and again, if I want to double click, we could add new nodes to add. So say, okay, I want this as my volume curve. Now, if I select these nodes and if I hold down Alt or Option, we could, once these nodes are selected, we could compress or expand the nodes. If I wanted to put more of a different, like S-shaped curved between the nodes, I could just hold down the Shift key, and then we could not have it be a straight linear line. Once these curves are set here, we could just come over here and we could shift these to the left or to the right. So as we would play this, we could hear the volume just automatically kind of change. So if I want to shift these to the right or flip them vertically, flip it horizontally, like left to right. So we have a lot of different control there. Now, a typical use of this, we would have curves. If I really love this curve, I could select it here and save it, but we have banks of curves here. So if I wanted to just say, okay, let's take this, and over one measure, we could have 2 beats that will be on and 2 beats that will be off. So let's say I wanted to change the rhythmic value of that. I could just click on Duplicate Curve. So we take kind of that one pad sound. And as we look at this, we can now... But let's say I don't want that to be kind of as separated or as staccato. I wanted to smooth that out. Or let's come over here to our filters bank. So I could actually say I only want that effect to be on particular frequencies, only on the very high-end frequencies, or only on the mid-range, or only on the low frequencies, or if I want it to be on all of the frequencies. Now let's come over here and say we have that for one measure, the volume kind of on and off. I wanted to adjust the pan. So I'm going to add pan into a module. So I'll just come here. Now, if we add an effect to a module and we want to erase it, all you have to do is kind of click in the upper right-hand corner, and it'll ask you, do you want to remove again? Click on the check, and then you could remove the particular module. So I want this to go up, and I want it to pan left to right, but over 2 measures. So we have 1 measure, 4 beats, and then 4 beats again. And let's add another module, maybe like a stereo width. And I want this to get wider over the course of 4 measures. And at this point, I want it to also just say, I want to say, let's change it up and just add maybe like a bit of a flanger. Okay, now we could have, and these are 6 different modules that function independently. So if I wanted to come here, I could actually just say, okay, on module 1, and if we wanted to mute the modules or solo the modules, we could come here, and I'll just turn off my trigger. So let's say, so if I only wanted to hear the panning isolated, I could just solo that particular module and how that's affecting. But what I want to do now is take a MIDI track here, and I want to set its input. All right, so I think it's maybe this one. So now if I go to my input here, I could just send a particular MIDI note, let's say to this module. So we'll just go ahead and solo this module. And we could now just come over here and trigger this via MIDI. So let's see if this is the... Or we could have our own independent gates. So we could set that up for MIDI control to turn that on and off. But let's say I want it to have different side chaining options. So we'll have our different effect here. And I'm going to open up my side chaining sources. And we'll go to our trigger. So let's say I have a kick that's going on. And I wanted the kick to be the side chain for the particular source here. So I'll activate side chaining. And let's just look for our kick track. So we'll do this so we have 6 independent side chainings for each module. So I'm going to add my sidechain source. And then I'm going to tell it to take it from sidechain 1. So let's say I want this to be. So we can hear that accent. And we'll just solo this so it's a little more obvious. So we have more of a release there. And let's say I have some bongos. So I will come over here to the flanger and let's come to our sidechain setup and we'll go to module 4 and let's add this to be our bongo. And now I'm going to activate the side chaining and we set it to sidechain input 4. So you could hear it kind of change with the particular as the bongo comes in. You could hear the flanging on it change, so let's add more flanging. And let's come over and let's say if I have a bass. So we'll have both these playing at once. I could go to my bass here. And we could just have a compressor. So without having to do any side chaining, I could just have the compressor automatically just duck as soon as the kick comes in. So not that it did side chain, but I could just now come here. So if we mute this, so as soon as the bass comes in, we can hear that it'll just do a heavy compression, as if we were side chaining it without having to do side chain. So now our kick can kind of have the context. So if I wanted to go back, let's say to my pad sound, and I really liked some of the aspects of we have a mix knob. So I could take the original sound and now blend that with the rhythmic activity. So I could have it all be kind of the new FX modulator or have that blended in with different sources. So again, 6 independent modules with independent side chaining on all of those. Now one other plugin that's been updated is also going to be the Supervision plugin. There's going to be 5 new modules for the Supervision plugin. So if I wanted to now come over here, the most obvious one that people are going to love is having the VU meters. So if we wanted to select your VU meters, we could come and at this point just say, okay, we want to go to our VU settings. We can say what type of meters do we want it to be? Do we want it different colors? Do I want it to be black? Track, it's all resizable. Or do I want it to be light? We have a frequency spectrum here, so we can see on a kind of a piano keyboard what frequencies are going to be visible. We have a level and loudness histogram and a phase balance that's also included here. So you can see what the phase relationship is between your left and right channels. So wonderful additions into the particular Supervision plugin that will make a big difference for all of your metering tasks. Now, as we work with this also, one other aspect that's changed is going to be the performance meter. So we could see, and the big difference here is we could see kind of the real-time performance, and this could be for tracks that are actively monitored for recording or that have record enabled. And we can also see the difference between those tracks performance-wise and those tracks that are being run on ASIO Guard. Plus, we can see our peak meters as well as our disk cache. So it's been kind of updated to show to highlight the difference between what's being done with ASIO Guard tracks versus what's done on tracks that are actually going to be part of the real-time input with that. Now, one of the aspects that's also been updated is logical editing functions. So we take a look at our different logical editing. We will open up some different scenarios here. And this is always a very powerful function in Cubase. And once you kind of get into the logical editor, it's incredibly powerful of being able to set up different conditions where, if this condition, like these notes are here or this event is here, and we want to do this to events that meet this particular criteria that's been defined. So in the past, some of the user interfaces they've been updated. So if we look at like our project logical editor, we'll see kind of a new modern design. When we go to our logical editor for MIDI information, we see that there's also kind of a new design. There's lots of confusion where people would delete presets, or if they downloaded logical editor presets, didn't know where to put them. So when we come to our presets, we'll actually see show the factory presets, and we see a lot more factory presets. And user presets have been kind of decoupled. So if you wanted to exchange presets or download presets, you could put them into the user presets, and the factory presets will kind of be protected so they don't get accidentally erased. So if we want to actually find what folder to put these into, we could click on the Show User Presets location. It will take you directly to that folder, and within that folder, you could have your own subfolders if you wanted to. So if you downloaded logical or project logical editor presets, you could just drop them into this folder. As soon as you go to the logical editor or project logical editor, you'll just come right here, and that will take you directly to the folder, so you don't have to kind of dig through menu options after menu options. Now, as we work with this, one of the things that was also updated to make it more clear was the input transformer. As we go to the input transformer here, we'll see that it used to be a little icon here that was very often missed. People were like, what does that do? Or people would never find it. So it's more obvious that's been added directly here. So we'll see a dedicated line for the input transformer. So as we look at this, we could now just say we want it to be a project or track. So previous terminology would be I think it was global and local. So instead of global and local, it's project and track based. So when we go to like a track, now that we open up the panel, we can now see that this user interface has also been updated. So it used to be that we would have 4 modules. The 4 modules weren't very obvious to a lot of people, and people could set up all sorts of wonderful conditions. And there was a subtle power on this module button that was often missed. So now you can't even set up different conditions unless the module has been activated. So again, more obvious, easier to use. There's more presets that come with it in addition to like your channel filtering. If your sustain pedal is backwards, you could just, invert the polarity of your sustain pedal. With this also, some other updates that have occurred is with kind of in this theme is when we go to our MIDI plugins. Let's say if we go to our MIDI insert plugin, that we will have the transformer plugin. And it used to be that the transformer would automatically just kind of show you it would be just the logical editor presets. And this would kind of in real time transform, I wanted to take my expression, my modulation, and turn it into expression in real time. So a lot of the settings in logical editing weren't necessarily set up for real-time MIDI transformation. So there's kind of dedicated presets that are ideal for that. When we go to our MIDI editor, our logical editor, so as we come over here, we can see that one of the things that we'll see is kind of how the presets can be a bit decoupled. So when we go to our logical editor, we can see our logical editor setup, but we could also just kind of have our presets and have these presets just kind of floating. So if we are doing lots of logical editing, I could just leave this window open here without having to always go to a particular, menu option to be able to access those particular presets. So when working with the logical editor, we can come and let's say we go to the setup. So there's two new processes. So if I wanted to come here, we could choose to deselect. So it used to be that we could select particular events, but now we could choose to deselect events, and also a new function for extract to lanes. So let's say if I wanted to come here and I'll select all of my MIDI notes here, and let's say, okay, my lowest MIDI note, I want to say, we're going to select everything here, and I want to, instead of deleting or transforming or inserting or selecting, to deselect. So I'm going to say deselect notes that where value 1, which is pitch, and all these values are in the documentation, and we'll say is less than we'll say E3. So when I do this correctly, so all these notes are selected, I can now just deselect those particular notes that below a particular value. So really helpful for that. Now all of these events are within the same part. And a lot of times people will work with lanes. So now with the logical editor, we can just come over here and just choose to extract to lane. So I can say we want to take every note below E3 and extract it to a new MIDI lane. So as we come over here, we'll see that we have two lanes. So when we double click on this lane, so they're still within the same part, we have the lower notes. We double click on this lane, we have the notes above E3. So we could come over there and extract to particular lanes. There's some new functions for channel for event target filters. So if we say we want to take our notes, and let's say I wanted to have notes here and I have a cycle marker, and I'm going to select this cycle marker here. So if we want to go to our logical editor again, we'll come over here and I say, I want to delete, and we'll say we want to take all notes, and we're going to go to our position. And when we come here, we'll say is inside selected marker. So once we have that done, we can say our marker is selected here. I hit apply, and now we could just delete all of those particular notes that fall within the selected marker. So we could just do it just like that. Now, some new functions have also been added to the project logical editor. So when we want to open this up, one of the things that people wanted to do for a really long time is if we had automation on a particular track, we could adjust the automation before, but it would only do it in percentages. So you could say, take the automation up 99% or down 10%, but a lot of people wanted it in a value of a dB. So we'll have kind of our same process was added for deselecting functions. But let's say I have this track with automation here, and I want it to just raise or lower the automation by 1 dB. So when we do this, we will say, okay, we click on insert. So we want to transform. I'll say, let's take our media type is equal to automation. And what I want to do now is we'll do insert again, and there's a new function that's been added. So when we say property, because a lot of times we don't want to necessarily open up the automation track, we want to have we want to have the track selected, not the automation track. So there's a new function. We'll say event is set to parent object is selected. So in this case, if the parent object is the track, I will now come over here. Let's click on trim, and we'll say let's increment in dB by 1 dB. So now as I hit apply, we look at our automation. It'll now just take the automation on our selected track and increment it up 1 dB, or we could decrement it down by 1 dB as well. So I could just select the track. I don't have to open up the automation lane, select the track, and I could just do my automation just that easily. Some other little things that have been added to make things a bit easier. So let's say I want to take these selected tracks, and all of these tracks are particular colors. So I want to, we'll just set up conditions to do like changing colors. So we say, okay, I want to we'll insert our first criteria. So we want to say our container type is going to be set to a track. And we could even do, okay, I want to set the property here. We'll set to, property is set to the event is selected. So what I want to do now in my event transform, so selected tracks, what I want to do at this point is come over here and we could set color, and we have new options where we could increment or decrement the colors. So if I see the color of all these tracks, I could just come right over here and cycle through the different colors in my color palette. And if I wanted to do that only for selected tracks, we could come right there and now increment and decrement just those particular selected track colors. Also, if we wanted to do this, we could set up different naming conventions. So let's say I have audio 01, audio 02, audio 03. So I wanted to take the selected tracks, and they don't have to be selected, but we'll just do this for sake of demonstration. And at this point, I want to do naming conventions. So we see that they're all audio 01, all audio 02. So I want to say there's 4 new operations here. So we could erase before, erase after, erase front character, erase end character. So I'm just going to type in 0. So all these are audio 01, audio 02, 03. So I want to get rid of the word audio. So now when I come here, I'll hit apply, and all the tracks we could just have automatically. I'll redo that again. So we'll say, and we'll just say we'll say erase before 0. So now when I click there, we could just have the numbers. So everything that was before this character that I typed in will be deleted. Let's say we go to our audio connections. I have stereo out and stereo out 2. So let's say all of these tracks are set to stereo output. What else we could do is we could change the physical inputs and outputs of tracks in the project logical editor as well. So now what I want to do, I'll remove this. So we're going to say, again, take our selected tracks here, but we could set up any myriad of conditions. We'll insert, and we'll go to track operation, and we'll say connect output. So we'll see all of my MIDI outputs, and I'll say, here's all of my audio outputs. So now I'll click apply. The output of all these tracks is now set to stereo out 2. So we could do these things globally. Now, many times we may have different instruments here that may not have, this is a common question I would get on live streams as well, of can I kind of do this within a macro type of environment? So in previous versions, we could trigger a macro, but not a single key command. So I created a setting here. So we could have 4 pre-process events. So if I wanted to select all on this track, I could do that, or I could create 4 different project logical editor conditions if necessary. Then we could do our function and then do 4 functions after our project logical editor has happened. This could be a bit German. We'll give you that. So let's say I have instruments that have no data in them. So these are taking up, let's say they're still, like, I just wanted to take tracks that were empty and I wanted to disable them so that those tracks don't take up any memory. And I wanted to also hide those particular tracks. So if I have a large template and now I only want to see tracks that has actual data, and I wanted to disable tracks that didn't have data and hide those, we can just come over here. So I'm going to say media type is equal to MIDI, and in this case, and I'll say, we're going to say our container type is a track, and the property of that track is it's empty. Then once this runs, we'll say the audio, we'll just choose audio disable enable track, and under channel and track visibility, hide selected. So let's come over here, and I will now just click apply. And as we do that, my MIDI tracks that I had that were there are now just hidden because they didn't have any data on them. So this is kind of the power features that you're able to do. So, create your condition, do these 4 things, then create your condition, and then do 4 more things. And again, we could trigger this with one particular function, one particular, MIDI control setup, or a keyboard shortcut. Now, one of the most powerful things that's been created is this concept of the new MIDI remote control functions. So we'll come over here, we'll say, okay, we have a new lower zone set up. So we can see our mix console, our editors, we could have, our sampler track, chord pads, and now we have this concept of different MIDI remote controls. So we could create different MIDI remote controls, but the concept is that many companies will be creating these particular scripts, and these scripts will allow the particular companies to have almost a plug and play experience for different controls. So if we wanted to see, so we could see right off the bat, we'll have for Arturia, some Novation, Akai, like Chord Nano controls. If you connect these, they will automatically be recognized and kind of be pre-mapped for Cubase for you. Now, as we do this, probably more companies will be creating these scripts and releasing them. It'll be part of the program. You connect your controller, and it's going to be kind of configured automatically for you. So the concept is we want to see kind of a physical representation of your controller and map those parameters intelligently to different functions. So let's say on my desk in front of me, I have a Nectar P4. So what I want to do is to come over here, and I'm going to start from scratch. So I'm going to say, we're going to say our panorama. So we'll just say, all right, so I'm going to just disable my script real quick here on this one. Give me just a second here so I can free up this script. For demonstration purposes here. Okay. So starting from scratch. So we'll say, okay, I want my P4. I'll set the MIDI input and the MIDI output. All right, so we give it our manufacturer, and I'll just call this Panorama P4. Okay, you could type your name in as a script creator. So now that we've done this, and I'll go ahead and maximize this, we're in our surface editor area. So if we wanted to, again, just kind of come right over here, what we want to do is as soon as that's been defined, we could go to our surface editor. So now what I want to do is just all right, and I'm going to just kind of create, I have 8 knobs. So I'm moving these knobs on my controller. So let's say I'll come here, and we could choose whether we have knobs, faders, or buttons. So I'll just say, okay, I'll come right here. I'll move that knob. So what I want to do now at this point is, all right, so I have 9 faders on my Nectar. So all I had to do is kind of say, okay, I want a fader. I want this to be bigger. And now as I move the fader, it will automatically populate and create the particular object here. So I'm basically building a software version of my controller. And I'll go ahead and we'll just make this a little bigger so we can see it. And now what I want to do is we'll just add, let's say, buttons. So I have some buttons here. All right, and we just put this fader back to where we were. So I do this without my keyboard falling. Okay, so I'll just move that particular. All right, so now we want to put buttons in. So I want my buttons to be smaller in size. So I'm going to come here and let's make this button this size, and I'll click. And now as I click on the buttons, okay. And at this point, I wanted to add maybe buttons for transport. So we'll just come over here, and as I just hit the buttons on my controller, again, this is just automatically populating. All right, so let's add some buttons here, and I want these buttons to be a little larger. And I have 8 encoders, so I'm going to put encoders here, and maybe I would use something like these for quick controls. So just touching the control on my controller. All right, and I also have drum pads. So let's say if I wanted to put my drum pads for different controls, I'll make these a little larger, and I'm just hit the drum pads, and again, it automatically populates. So we have 3 banks of 4 drum pads. Okay, so I have kind of the layout of my particular controls. And now what we could do is we could go to what we call the mapping assistant. So, and we'll go ahead and just kind of tuck this away real quick. So let's say I want to assign particular functions. We could open up the mapping assistant a couple of ways. One is just by clicking here. We could see the mapping assistant. And then if we wanted to open it up here. Now, in previous versions, this wasn't like the most intuitive way when we wanted to do large scripts. So let's say if we go to our generic remote, people would, map thousands of different parameters, and I applaud, the people like Luke Johnson and Carol Ibarra who just, would do this. But this was a painful process to map because there's always this correlation between as we select this controller that it's, these two were related, even though they're kind of on top of each other. And we could do quick controls for tracks or for plugins. So that wasn't like the best method of doing that. But now what we could do, if I wanted to assign particular functions to programs or to buttons, I could hit the button itself. And, at this point, when we see the button, we could choose different resolutions. So we can see 14-bit or 14-bit and RPN. But I'm going to just come right over here and right-click on the function that I want to assign to that button. So some functions I could just right-click. And then we could just say, oh, that's my record button. So what I want to do is we could just choose to assign the particular parameter just like that. So if we wanted to do that, so if I hit the play button, I could just come right over here and we go to play. And then we could just assign the particular mapping to the control. Now we could also just, as we select the particular events, let's say I come here, I move my encoder. We see that as I touch the encoder on my controller, these are automatically selected. So I want to now come right over here, and let's say I want to assign these to quick controls. So I will just click on this little pop-out window here, and we'll say, okay, let's go to focus quick controls. So I can move the knob that is selected, and now I could just double click and then apply that particular mapping. So I move knob 2, that gets selected, click once, double click, it's assigned. Go to encoder 3, and now encoder 4. So as we do this, we could just come over here, and I'll just do this for my quick controls easily. And I'll move it encoder 7 now. So again, I just select a parameter, it's selected for me, and we could just come right over there. Now let's say I wanted to assign a particular parameter over here. So let's say and we could also assign one of these. Let's say I want to take this quick control instead. And many people who have a CC121 love this function. It's called the quick control. So I'm going to just assign this to the quick control. And let's say I wanted to now select a pad. And this pad, I wanted to come over here, and we could see all of the different functions in the programs, because there could be thousands of different functions. So we could just come over here and say, okay, I wanted to go to my mixer, or better yet, so if I just wanted to come here to edit, I can see all of my editing parameters. So instead of going through like a really cryptic, hard to navigate list, I can now just come right over here and I say mixer. So, and I say, let's add mixer 1 to that button. So I hit pad 2. I want this to be my click track. So I could, again, come right over here. Let's activate the metronome, pick up for remote mapping, and just kind of click again right on the particular functions. So again, just assign our transport, click on the button, right click, and assign and apply the mapping. So we could assign these different parameters for any function in our particular controller. So once we have this kind of set up as we want, all we have to do now is we can come over, let's say we go to a audio track here, and when we go to our audio tracks, we could have quick controls on the audio track. But let's say also we have an insert of maybe the bass amp. So we'll come here. Okay, so a lot of people would get confused with quick controls, because quick controls could often be used to control the plugins, like so, or if it was a track that was selected, it might control the quick controls kind of at the track level. So we wanted to make the focus a bit more obvious. So let's say we go back to our controller here. We could, as we come here, we could just say our focus. So I could say we have track and plugin window focus. So if my plugin is the active window, I move the quick controls, it's controlling that. If my track is selected. Now it's controlling the track control plugins and not the plugin. At times, you may want it to be the track focus only or the plugin window focus only. So you could set that. Most people will leave this at kind of whatever you click will automatically be assigned. Now, when we want to assign particular parameters to a quick control, each of the plugins, if we go to the upper right-hand corner, has this little QC option. So as we work with this, we could see kind of the parameters that the quick controls are assigned to. We could assign them to any parameter directly here, but there's also a learn mode. So I could say, okay, I want this particular parameter, so I'm going to move this knob, and now that knob is assigned to that quick control parameter. So if I want to go to quick control 8, and let's click on learn for that, we could now just come over, click on learn, and you could click and say, okay, I want that to be that particular function. So now as we would adjust the quick controls, we can just, go back and forth between the different parameters, depending on what's the active window, or we could set that. And now we could quickly define the plugin parameters that we want for the quick control, and we could kind of tuck that away. We could also lock these quick control parameters to a plugin, so it'll be kind of locked to that even if that plugin, I believe, is out of focus. So at this point, we could come over here and have tremendous amount of control. So my controller can be mapped to just about any function that I want it to be. Now, we mentioned that we had assigned one of the encoders to an AI knob. So if you don't want to go through the pain of assigning different parameters with the AI knob, you could hover the mouse over, and that parameter will automatically adjust whatever the mouse is assigned, whatever it's hovering over. So if I want it to come here to this quick control slot, I want it to open up the channel view, I want it to adjust the fader, that one single encoder can come over here, and whatever your mouse is hovering over, it is automatically controlling. That's what the mouse wheel AI knob function does. So I could just come here, and I have one encoder that's kind of always assigned to whatever my mouse is hovering over. Now, as we mentioned, we'll have lots of people and companies developing these scripts for your controller over time, so that this will be a much better user experience. Like customers I've already talked to said, wow, I've gotten more out of my MIDI controller in like 10 minutes using this new system than I've had for years, because you could quickly see it. And if you have other different parameters, we could go home. Like I have an Elgato Stream Deck that I have configured. And on my personal computer, I went through, and we're not, while it's designed to mimic kind of the physical layout of your controller, for my Stream Deck, where each of these buttons could go to a different menu, I have every single menu option in Cubase mapped out to my Stream Deck using this new system. So even though it kind of is set up to mimic the physical layout of your controller, it's not limited to that. So if you have, a controller that's tablet based and it's assigned to 1,200 different functions, you could assign those 1,200 different functions very easily using the mapping assistant and migrate to a new, better system. So this way you could take the existing MIDI controller that's on your desk and integrate it much better. So as we kind of work with this, there are some discontinued features that will be that haven't made it into version 12. Sometimes some code isn't going to work. There is a transition because some plugins may not be able to be technically changed to work in like Apple Silicon. So there's some features that are kind of being grandfathered out. So we'll see rewire support that's been ended by the company that developed it. We'll also see Mystic Prologue, Spectre, and the Loop Mash VST instruments. The Loop Mash FX is still in the program, but the Loop Mash instrument. So some of those we didn't own the source code for and weren't able to migrate to, further operating systems. So that's kind of some of the reasons with that. Now, in about 4 to 6 weeks, we may see an update. And this would be a free update for all Cubase 12 owners. And that will be adding a couple things. One of the things that will be adding is Dolby Atmos support. So at this point, we will be able to do Dolby Atmos mixing for music production as part of Cubase. So look for that in about a month. So if we kind of take a look at all of what we discussed, and we realize it's a tremendous amount of information, but we will see that we're going to have not only Apple M1 support, Threadripper support for the AMD processors, Windows RT MIDI for Bluetooth MIDI. We're going to have, also all of the different editing tasks that we've gone through, the importing and exporting with different effects and side chains, and being able to have the new licensing system, which is a key thing. So you're not going to be tied to your particular USB-E licenser to run Cubase. There may still be some plugins that require it. Over time, all of the programs will be updated and migrated to the new licensing system. So if you have Halion or full versions of Groove Agent, you may still need to have those on a USB-E licenser if that's where they're at. But we see a lot of importing and exporting improvements, little subtle things like the effects working as people want them, even if it's not technically correct. It gives the results that people want. The inclusion of sidechain support. You're going to have also the capabilities for exporting selected events, warping on the project window, as well as warping multiple events and warping to different grid factors, such as triplets in the sample editor. Also, when we get into being able to create chord tracks from audio to have the scale correction in Vari Audio, and then we start getting into the Verve, the felt piano instrument, improvements in the step filter, the new Razor plugin, as well as the FX modulator, which is just full of creative possibilities. Going into the new dithering options, the new VU meter in Supervision with 4 other analysis modules, new display meter, and also as we take a look, we're going to have the capability of being able to utilize the controller that's probably sitting on your desk that hasn't been fully utilized, hasn't worked as well as it could have been, into this whole new MIDI remote system. So if you think of all those wonderful things that we see in Cubase 12, you can see that it's a really strong and powerful update. So that's a quick run through. We know it probably took a long time, but we just wanted to be able to kind of show in detail some of the new features. We will be doing these live streams again, and we'll kind of start on Tuesday. We do these on Tuesday and Friday where we take questions on how to use functions in Cubase, and different Steinberg related functions for different Steinberg programs in a standard Q&A format. These are indexed with timestamps. There's websites like Cubase Index where you could search for these features. So as you learn all the new features in Cubase 12, we'll just make sure that you're able to understand and utilize all the new functions. So as you can see, the team at Steinberg has really done a wonderful job listening to small details of what users are working with, improving things like the logical editor to make it more accessible, all those things. And so I just want to give a special kudos to the Cubase project planning team, the developers, because they have really once again done a spectacular job with Cubase 12, and they make my job so much easier. So with that, we'll go ahead and end the live stream, and we'll kind of return on Tuesday with our typical Q&A session, but we hope that everyone has learned something new and you're excited about the new features in Cubase 12. Goodbye. Have a great weekend.